We already signed the papers. We just need your signature, Evelyn, my daughter-in-law said as she placed the folder beside my dinner plate like she was setting down a basket of rolls instead of dismantling the last stable thing in my life. Ryan didn't look at me when she said it. He kept cutting his steak into careful little squares, his eyes fixed on the plate in front of him, while the chandelier above the dining table cast soft golden light across the house my husband and I had spent 38 years paying for. The smell of rosemary chicken still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of Claire's expensive vanilla perfume. For a moment, nobody spoke. I looked down at the folder. My name had already been typed neatly across the bottom of the paperwork. All that remained was a signature. Mine. It's just for convenience, Claire continued gently, her tone polished and calm in the way people speak when they've rehearsed compassion in advance. This house is simply too much responsibility now. We thought it would be easier if Ryan handled everything moving forward. Easier. That word settled into my chest heavier than grief itself. My husband Walter had been dead for only 11 days. 11 days since I sat beside his hospital bed listening to machines breathe for him while snow fell quietly outside the Hartford skyline. 11 days since Ryan cried into my shoulder at the funeral and told me we'd get through this together. Now he sat across from me, unable to lift his eyes from a dinner plate, while his wife explained why I should surrender my home. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my untouched glass of iced tea. The silence stretched long enough for Claire to shift slightly in her chair. She hated silence. She always filled it quickly, nervously, as if she believed enough words could control the direction of a room. We've already started talking to a realtor, she added carefully, just to explore options. There it was. Not grief. Not concern. A timeline. A plan already moving forward before I had even finished writing thank you cards for the funeral flowers. My eyes drifted toward the living room archway where Walter's reading. Glasses still rested on the arm of his favorite leather chair. Nobody had touched them. I couldn't bring myself to move them yet. Some mornings I still woke up expecting to hear him downstairs grinding coffee beans or humming old Frank Sinatra songs while feeding the dog we buried 3 winters ago. Loss changes the sound of a house. It removes something invisible from the air itself. Ryan finally cleared his throat. Mom, Claire's only trying to help. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. At 42, my son still had the same blue eyes he'd had as a little boy, standing beside me on the first day of kindergarten, holding my hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Back then he used to ask permission before taking cookies from the kitchen cabinet. Now he sat in my dining room, discussing my future like I was no longer fully present. Help me do what? I asked quietly. Claire leaned forward slightly, folding her manicured hands together. Downsize. Simplify your life. Maybe move somewhere with less upkeep. Somewhere safer. Safer. Another carefully selected word. I almost smiled. The house had never felt unsafe until now. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the backyard Walter had spent years landscaping himself. Every stone pathway, every rose bush, every inch of the cedar deck had passed through his hands. This wasn't simply property. It was evidence that we had existed together. We found a beautiful retirement community 20 minutes away, Claire continued. There's a fitness center, social activities, transportation. I'm not incapable, Claire, I said calmly. Her lips tightened for half a second before the polite smile returned. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nobody's saying that, Mom. But they were. Just not directly. That was Claire's talent. She never pushed hard enough to seem cruel. She simply guided conversations toward outcomes she had already chosen. I noticed then that the folder wasn't alone. Beside it sat a yellow sticky note listing 3 moving companies and 2 assisted living facilities. Claire followed my eyes and quickly turned the paper over. Too late. Something cold settled inside me. Then, not anger, not shock, clarity. Walter used to say that people revealed themselves most honestly when they believed you were powerless. Across the table, Claire reached for her wine glass. We're thinking long-term here, Evelyn. We. Not you. Not family. We. A unit I no longer belong to. Ryan finally looked up at me, and for a split second guilt flickered across his face before disappearing beneath exhaustion. Mom, he said softly, you don't have to decide tonight. But they already had. That was the point. I glanced once more around the dining room. The framed wedding photograph near the staircase. the grandfather clock Walter inherited from his father. The candle Claire had lit before dinner to make the room feel warm, while discussing where I would live after surrendering the home I built with my husband. I reached for the folder slowly, resting my fingertips against the cover without opening it. Claire relaxed slightly, mistaking calmness for surrender. Ryan exhaled quietly. Neither of them understood me at all anymore. I looked down at the typed signature line waiting patiently at the bottom of the stack and smiled faintly. "All right," I said softly, "if that's what you've decided." The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the unfamiliar silence of a house that no longer felt entirely mine. For 38 years, Walter had been the first one awake. He used to shuffle downstairs in plaid slippers and start the coffee maker before the rest of the neighborhood lights flickered on across our street. Even after retirement, he kept the same habits. 6 o'clock coffee, 7 o'clock newspaper, 8 o'clock weather report loud enough for the entire kitchen to hear. Now the only sound came from the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway and the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment staring at Walter's side of the mattress, still slightly indented despite the fresh sheets. Grief had a strange way of preserving small things. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the aftershave he had worn for 20 years. Outside the bedroom window, Connecticut looked washed pale beneath a layer of freezing rain. Bare tree branches trembled against the gray morning sky while the driveway shimmered with thin ice. I wrapped my robe tighter around myself and walked slowly downstairs, one hand trailing along the banister. Walter refinished himself the summer Ryan graduated high school. Every corner of the house carried his fingerprints. That was what Claire would never understand. To her, it was square footage, market value, a future investment. To me, it was proof that two people had once loved each other enough to build a life one paycheck at a time. The kitchen lights were already on when I entered. Claire stood beside the counter scrolling through her phone while sipping coffee from one of my mugs. My mug, actually. White porcelain with tiny blue flowers around the rim. Walter bought it for me during our trip to Vermont 15 years ago after I accidentally dropped my favorite cup in a hotel parking lot. Claire barely looked up. "Morning," she said casually. Ryan left early for the office. I nodded quietly and reached for the coffee maker. There was barely enough left for half a cup. Claire noticed and smiled without apology. "I can make more later." Later. Everything in my life suddenly seemed scheduled around their convenience. I poured what remained into a mug and sat at the kitchen table while Claire continued tapping at her phone. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned back, and she already looked prepared for the day while I still felt suspended somewhere between widowhood and disbelief. "A realtor is stopping by Thursday afternoon," she said suddenly, still looking down at the screen. "Just to evaluate the property." Property. Not home. Never home. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug. I was not aware the house was for sale. Claire finally glanced up then, her expression patient in the way adults speak to difficult children. "We are only exploring options, Evelyn. It makes more sense financially." There was that word again. We. As if Walter's death had quietly removed me from ownership of my own life. Before I could answer, footsteps sounded from upstairs. Ryan appeared wearing a navy overcoat and carrying his laptop bag. He paused when he saw us sitting in silence. "Morning, Mom." He kissed the top of Claire's head before grabbing his keys from the counter. Small gestures reveal loyalties faster than words ever can. "You heading out?" I asked softly. "Big meeting downtown," he replied quickly. His eyes darted briefly toward Claire before settling anywhere except my face. "I might be late tonight." Claire stepped closer to him. "Do not forget dinner with the realtor Friday." Realtor. Dinner. Plans already unfolding around me like construction work beginning before demolition permits are approved. Ryan hesitated for half a second. "Right." Then he left. Just like that. The front door closed. Silence settled again. Claire walked upstairs carrying her coffee mug with her, leaving me alone at the kitchen table beside the untouched toast. Walter's toaster had burned slightly on one side every morning for 20 years. Around noon, I decided to gather laundry from the upstairs hallway closet. The moment I opened the linen cabinet, I froze. 3 of my boxes were missing. The blue storage bins containing Walter's winter scarves, old photo albums, and several framed pictures from our early marriage had disappeared. Slowly, I walked downstairs toward the basement door. Halfway down the steps, I saw them stacked against the far wall beside old paint cans and Christmas decorations. My throat tightened unexpectedly, not because of the boxes themselves, because nobody had asked. Someone had simply decided those memories were no longer important enough to remain upstairs. I stood there staring at the bins while the basement light buzzed softly overhead. Then I noticed something else. The keypad mounted near the garage entrance had been replaced. A newer model, different numbers glowing faintly blue against the wall. I pressed the old code automatically. Error. My stomach sank. I tried Walter's birthday. Error again. Claire's voice floated from upstairs. Oh, I forgot to mention. We updated the security system yesterday. While I slept upstairs beside my dead husband's empty pillow, they changed the locks to my own home. I closed my eyes briefly and rested one hand against the cold basement railing. Somewhere deep beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation and exhaustion, something quieter began settling into place. Not panic, not rage. Awareness. Walter used to say that people tell you exactly who they are once they stop needing your permission. Upstairs, Claire laughed softly during a phone call. Once the house is updated, she was saying, the resale value could easily jump another $200,000. I remained perfectly still in the basement shadows, listening carefully while the realization settled slowly into my chest. They were not waiting for me to recover from losing Walter. They were waiting for me to disappear. That evening, the house felt colder than the weather outside. Snow had started falling just after sunset, soft white flakes drifting across the backyard and settling over the cedar deck Walter built with his own hands nearly 12 years ago. I stood at the kitchen sink watching the storm gather beneath the porch lights while Claire moved around the dining room, speaking on speakerphone with someone she called the staging consultant. I had never heard those words connected to my home before. The furniture is outdated, Claire said casually while flipping through a notebook at the table. Especially the living room. The house needs a cleaner aesthetic if we want maximum value. Maximum value. I dried my hands carefully with a dish towel and remained facing the window a moment longer. In the reflection of the glass, I could see her sitting in Walter's chair. Not because she loved it, because she had already started positioning herself as the owner. Natural light is one of the strongest selling points, the woman on the phone replied. And if the older personal items are removed, buyers connect emotionally much faster. Older personal items. I almost smiled at the phrase. 38 years of marriage reduced to clutter, standing in the way of resale potential. Claire noticed my reflection in the window and lowered her voice slightly. I will call you tomorrow, she said before ending the call. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. You should not stand so long, Claire said finally. Your back will start bothering you. Again, concern sounded strange coming from someone who had changed my security code without warning. I turned slowly toward her. My back is fine. Claire gave a small nod and returned to organizing paperwork spread across the dining table. Realtor brochures, paint samples, estimated renovation costs. She did not even attempt to hide them anymore. The performance of patience had started slipping. I walked past the table quietly and paused near the staircase where framed family photographs lined the wall. Ryan at age 7 holding his first baseball glove. Walter teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the living room floor while cinnamon rolls baked in the kitchen. Claire was absent from most of those memories because she had not entered our lives until Ryan was 31 years old. Sometimes I wondered if that difference mattered more than I originally realized. She had inherited a finished story instead of helping build one. The realtor thinks we should repaint the upstairs hallway, Claire said without looking up. Probably something neutral. Light gray maybe. I stared at the photographs for another second before answering softly. Walter chose that wallpaper himself. Claire sighed almost invisibly. I know memories matter, Evelyn. But buyers prefer modern finishes. Buyers. Not family. Not us. Buyers. I climbed the stairs slowly and entered my bedroom, closing the door quietly behind me. Walter's navy cardigan still hung over the corner of the armchair beside the window exactly where he left it before his final hospital visit. Some evenings I caught myself reaching toward it automatically, as if touching the sleeve could somehow return the life that used to exist inside this house. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and opened the nightstand drawer where Walter kept old receipts, spare reading glasses, and random scraps of paper he insisted were important enough to save. Most people would have called the drawer disorganized. Walter called it the backup memory system. Beneath a stack of old utility bills, I found a folded envelope with my name written across the front in his handwriting. Evelyn. Simple. Steady. Familiar enough to tighten my chest instantly. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside rested a single business card for Thomas Reed, our attorney, with a short handwritten note beneath it. If things ever feel rushed after I am gone, call Thomas before signing anything. Promise me. I stared at the words for a very long time, while snow continued falling outside the bedroom windows. Walter had written the note at least a year ago, maybe longer. Slowly, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind. Walter insisting we meet privately with Thomas every spring. Walter reviewing paperwork more carefully after Ryan married Claire. Walter once joking quietly over coffee. Never confuse politeness with loyalty. At the time, I thought he was talking about business clients. Now I was no longer certain. Downstairs, I heard the front door open followed by Ryan's voice. Sorry I am late. Claire immediately launched into conversation about contractors and open houses while he responded with exhausted little sounds of agreement. I remained upstairs listening quietly from the edge of the bed. Not spying, simply noticing. The sooner we move forward, the better, Claire whispered, though not quietly enough. She is emotional now, but once everything is settled she will adjust. Adjust. Like grief was temporary discomfort rather than the collapse of an entire shared lifetime. Ryan answered too softly for me to hear clearly. Then Claire laughed gently. Trust me, this is the best thing for everyone. Everyone. I folded Walter's note carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand and removed the old leather address book Walter refused to replace with a cell phone contact list. Thomas Reed's office number was still written neatly beside the Hartford address we had used for nearly 20 years. I rested my hand on the phone for a moment without dialing. Downstairs, cabinet doors opened and closed while Claire continued discussing renovation ideas as though the future had already been transferred into her name. My eyes drifted toward the snow-covered backyard where Walter once spent entire Saturdays building birdhouses with Ryan when he was little. Back then my son used to run inside afterward smelling like sawdust and winter air asking if his father was proud of him. I wondered when exactly that little boy disappeared. Or perhaps worse, when he learned silence was easier than courage. Slowly, I picked up the phone and dialed Thomas Reed's number. Thomas Reed answered on the third ring the next morning while I sat alone in Walter's study with the door closed softly behind me. Outside the tall windows, the storm had passed, leaving the backyard covered in clean white snow that reflected pale winter sunlight across the bookshelves lining the walls. Walter always called this room the thinking place. Dark oak shelves, leather chairs, the faint smell of old paper and cedar polish lingering permanently in the air. Even now, his reading lamp remained angled toward the recliner where he used to spend evenings reviewing newspapers and muttering about politics under his breath. Evelyn, Thomas said gently after I introduced myself. His voice carried the kind of careful calm that comes from decades of handling family problems people pretend are only about paperwork. I was very sorry to hear about Walter. I closed my eyes briefly at the sound of my husband's name spoken aloud. Thank you, Thomas. Silence settled for a second before he spoke again, more cautiously this time. I wondered if you might call eventually. That sentence tightened something inside my chest. I glanced toward the closed study door instinctively, even though nobody upstairs could hear me. What exactly did Walter expect? I asked quietly. Thomas exhaled slowly. Your husband was a very observant man. I looked down at Walter's desk where a fountain pen still rested beside neatly stacked legal pads. Every object in the room seemed frozen in place, waiting for someone who would never walk back through the door again. He became concerned a few years ago. Thomas continued carefully. Not about Ryan entirely, more about influence, pressure, the possibility that grief might someday be used against you. My fingers tightened around the phone. Downstairs, I could faintly hear Claire moving dishes around in the kitchen while soft instrumental music played from the living room speakers. The house sounded normal. That was the unsettling part. Betrayal rarely announces itself loudly at first. Most of the time it arrives dressed as concern. Walter established certain protections, Thomas said, mostly precautionary. He hoped they would never become necessary. I swallowed carefully. Protections? I would prefer discussing details in person. His voice lowered slightly. Not at the house. The words settled heavily between us. Not at the house. As though the home Walter built had quietly become unsafe territory after his death. Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon? Thomas asked. Around 2. I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. After we ended the call, I remained seated in Walter's leather chair staring at the silent phone in my hands. Slowly, memories I once dismissed as harmless began resurfacing with sharper edges. Claire encouraging Walter to simplify financial paperwork after his first mild heart scare 3 years ago. Claire volunteering to organize important documents during Christmas visits. Claire insisting Ryan should eventually take over responsibility for the house because older people deserve less stress. At the time, I thought she sounded practical, helpful even. Now each memory returned rearranged into something colder. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I could answer, Claire opened the study door halfway. There you are, she said brightly. I was wondering where you disappeared to. Her eyes moved briefly across the room before landing on the phone in my hand. Everything okay? I nodded calmly and placed the receiver back onto the cradle. Just speaking with Martha Bennett. Claire relaxed immediately at the name of my old friend. Oh good. It would probably help to spend time with people right now. People, not family. I watched her carefully while she stepped farther into the room. She wore cream-colored slacks and a fitted sweater that matched the staged elegance she tried bringing into every space she entered. Claire always looked composed, even while dismantling someone else's comfort. Her gaze drifted across Walter's desk. I actually wanted to ask you something, she said. Would you mind if the realtor took measurements in here on Friday? I stared at her for a second longer than necessary. Measurements? Only because buyers love home offices now. Especially after remote work became so common. Buyers again. Everything now filtered through future resale potential. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. Walter died less than 2 weeks ago. Claire's smile faltered for half a heartbeat before returning smoother than before. I know this is emotional, Evelyn. But delaying these decisions only makes things harder later. Emotional. Another carefully chosen word. As though my attachment to my husband's study represented temporary instability rather than basic human grief. She stepped closer to the bookshelf and lightly brushed dust from one of Walter's framed military photographs. Ryan worries about you being alone here. I almost laughed at that. Ryan had not asked me once how I was sleeping since the funeral. He had not noticed the untouched meals in the refrigerator or the fact that I still woke up crying some mornings before dawn. But apparently he worried about square footage and maintenance costs. I am not alone, I said softly. Claire tilted her head slightly. What does that mean? My eyes moved slowly across the study. Walter's books. Walter's chair. Walter's handwriting inside half-finished crossword puzzles stacked beside the lamp. It means this house still belongs to my husband in ways you do not understand. For the first time since Walter died, something sharp flickered openly across Claire's expression. Irritation. Not grief. Not sympathy. Irritation at resistance. It vanished almost immediately beneath another polished smile. Of course, she said gently. Nobody is trying to take that away. But they were. Piece by piece. Room by room. Decision by decision. Claire stepped back toward the hallway. Oh, one more thing, she added casually. The realtor suggested neutralizing some of the older decor before the photography appointment. Especially family portraits. Buyers connect better when spaces feel less personal. Less personal. I waited until she disappeared downstairs before slowly turning toward the framed photograph sitting on Walter's desk. It was taken the summer Ryan turned 10. Walter stood beside him near the lake house we rented every August, both of them sunburned and smiling while holding fishing rods almost taller than Ryan himself. I picked up the frame carefully and brushed my thumb across the glass. You saw this coming, did you not? I whispered quietly into the empty study. Downstairs, Claire laughed at something on television while cabinet doors opened and closed in the kitchen. The sound echoed strangely through the house now, like someone rehearsing ownership before the transfer was complete. The next afternoon, I drove into downtown Hartford beneath a pale gray sky that threatened more snow by evening. The roads were wet with melting slush, and every traffic light seemed to linger longer than usual, giving me too much time to think. Walter used to drive whenever we came into the city together. He hated the way I gripped the steering wheel during winter traffic. You drive like the road personally insulted you. He would joke while reaching over to turn on jazz music whenever my shoulders tightened. I caught myself glancing toward the passenger seat twice before remembering there would be nobody sitting there anymore. Thomas Reed's office occupied the fourth floor of an old brick building overlooking Main Street. The elevator still had brass buttons polished, so often they reflected distorted shapes like cloudy mirrors. When I stepped into the reception area, the scent of coffee and old leather immediately reminded me of every estate planning meeting Walter ever insisted we attend together. At the time, I thought he was simply organized, careful. Now I was beginning to understand something else entirely. Thomas himself opened the office door before the receptionist could announce me. "Evelyn," he said quietly, shaking my hand with both of his. His silver hair had thinned considerably over the years, but his eyes remained sharp and observant beneath wire-rimmed glasses. "You look tired." I almost laughed at the understatement. Instead, I followed him into his office where tall windows overlooked the snowy city streets below. The room looked exactly the same as I remembered. Dark wood shelves. Legal books nobody under 60 probably read anymore. A framed photograph of Thomas and Walter standing beside a golf cart sometime during the late 1990s. Seeing Walter smiling naturally in the picture tightened my chest unexpectedly. Thomas noticed my eyes linger there. "Your husband trusted very few people completely," he said softly while closing the office door behind us. I was honored to be one of them. I sat carefully across from his desk while he opened a thick black folder already waiting beside a legal pad. My name was written neatly across the tab. Evelyn Harper Trust Documents. The sight of it made my stomach tense slightly. Thomas folded his hands together. "Before we discuss specifics, I need to ask directly. Has anyone pressured you to transfer ownership of the house?" I hesitated only briefly. "Claire presented paperwork 3 nights ago." Thomas nodded once, unsurprised. "And Ryan?" He said very little. Something unreadable crossed Thomas's face then. Not judgment exactly. Sadness perhaps. Walter worried that might happen. My eyes moved slowly toward the snowy windows. How long had he been worried? Thomas leaned back carefully in his chair. Long enough to restructure several things after Ryan married Claire. Silence settled heavily across the office. Somewhere beyond the closed door, a copier machine hummed faintly while phones rang in distant reception areas. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. It felt strange hearing ordinary life continue while mine quietly shifted beneath my feet. Thomas opened the folder and slid several documents across the desk toward me. "The house is not directly owned by Ryan," he explained calmly. "It never was." I stared down at the paperwork without fully understanding at first. Legal terminology blurred together beneath the overhead light. Trust beneficiary. Property control provisions. Revocable family trust. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Approximately 6 years ago, Walter transferred the property into a protected trust under your authority. The structure prevents forced sale or ownership transfer without your direct approval and legal review." I looked up slowly. "Ryan does not know this." "No," Thomas paused. "Neither does Claire." A strange stillness spread through me then. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. Like finally seeing the shape of a room after standing in darkness too long. "Walter believed there might come a day when grief made you vulnerable to pressure," Thomas continued gently. "He wanted safeguards in place if anyone ever tried rushing decisions after his death." My throat tightened unexpectedly. Walter had known me well enough to predict exactly how this might unfold. The grief, the exhaustion, the temptation to surrender simply because fighting felt too heavy. Thomas slid another document toward me. "There is more." I glanced down again. This page looked different. More severe somehow. "The trust contains a behavioral clause," Thomas explained. "If any beneficiary attempts coercion, intimidation, or manipulation regarding estate assets after Walter's death, their inheritance rights can be significantly reduced or removed entirely." I blinked once. "Walter put that in writing?" Thomas gave a slow nod. "Very specifically." Outside the office windows, snow began falling again in soft white sheets across the city skyline. I thought about Ryan as a little boy building snow forts in our backyard, while Walter pretended not to notice when he tracked muddy boots across the kitchen floor. I thought about the teenager who once saved allowance money for 3 months to buy me perfume for Mother's Day because he overheard me mention liking the scent in a department store. Somewhere between those years and now, something fragile inside my son had weakened. Or perhaps someone slowly taught him convenience mattered more than loyalty. Can Claire force me out legally? I asked quietly. Thomas almost smiled at the question. Absolutely not. The certainty in his voice settled deeper than comfort. It felt like oxygen after weeks underwater. In fact, he added carefully, if they continue pressuring you after knowing these terms exist, they could trigger consequences Walter intentionally designed to prevent. Exactly this kind of situation. I looked down again at Walter's signature near the bottom of the final page. Steady, firm, deliberate. My husband had seen the possibility of betrayal before I ever allowed myself to imagine it. Not because he distrusted me, because he understood human weakness better than I did. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, you do not need to make any decisions immediately. And you certainly do not need to leave your home. Home, not property, not asset. Home. For the first time since Walter died, I felt something unfamiliar returning beneath the grief and exhaustion. Stability, quiet and steady, like hearing my own voice clearly again after weeks of listening to everyone else speak over it. I folded the documents carefully back into the folder and rested my hand on top of them. Then I looked up at Thomas calmly. I think I understand now why Walter wanted me to wait before signing anything. When I returned home from Hartford that evening, the driveway was already crowded with unfamiliar cars. A black SUV sat near the garage, while a silver sedan I had never seen before occupied Walter's usual parking space beside the front walkway. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had forgotten some family gathering or neighborhood event in the fog of recent weeks. Then I noticed the measuring tape stretched across the front porch railing and the clipboard resting against one of the flower pots Walter built by hand 2 summers ago. Claire had not waited for permission after all. She had moved directly into preparation mode. Snow crunched softly beneath my boots as I walked toward the front door, carrying my purse and the black folder Thomas Reed gave me earlier that afternoon. Through the front windows, I could already see strangers moving through my living room beneath the warm yellow glow of the chandelier. One woman pointed toward the staircase, while another man studied the crown molding near the fireplace. I stopped just inside the doorway. The scent of expensive perfume and wet winter coats filled the air, replacing the familiar smell of cedar and cinnamon that used to greet me every evening when Walter was alive. Claire appeared almost immediately, her expression brightening with practiced enthusiasm. There you are, she said quickly. The realtor was able to stop by earlier than expected. Realtor. Earlier than expected. As though discussing weather changes instead of bringing strangers into my home less than 2 weeks after my husband's funeral. I removed my gloves slowly and glanced around the room. The framed family photograph that normally sat above the fireplace mantel had disappeared. So had the handmade quilt Walter's mother stitched decades ago. In their place sat decorative candles and neutral-colored throw pillows I had never seen before. We thought the space should feel more open, Claire explained casually when she noticed me looking around. More open. That was one way to describe removing evidence of the people who actually lived here. A tall man in a charcoal coat stepped forward holding a leather portfolio. Mrs. Harper, he said with a professional smile. I am Michael Tanner. Claire mentioned you were considering listing the property. I looked directly at Claire before answering. Did she? Something subtle shifted across Michael's expression. Realtors recognized tension quickly. Claire stepped closer before silence could become uncomfortable. We are only exploring possibilities right now, she said smoothly. Nothing official yet. Yet, I almost admired how naturally she inserted certainty into situations still dependent on my cooperation. Ryan emerged from the dining room then, loosening his tie while balancing a coffee mug in one hand. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Mom, he said quietly. We were going to call you. You changed the locks without calling me first, I replied calmly. The room fell silent for half a second. Michael suddenly became very interested in his paperwork. Claire recovered first, smiling tightly. The security company recommended updating the system after Walter passed away. We thought it was safer. Safer. Again that word. Always disguised as concern. One of the women near the staircase interrupted awkwardly. The natural light upstairs is beautiful, by the way. Claire immediately brightened. That was one of the selling points we noticed. 2. Selling points. I stood very still beneath the foyer chandelier listening to strangers discuss my home like a future investment package while snow continued falling softly beyond the windows. Walter used to stand in this exact spot every Christmas morning, holding a cup of coffee while Ryan raced downstairs half awake looking for presents. Life changes quietly at first. Then one day you realize your memories and someone else's ambitions are standing in the same room competing for space. The study photographs especially well, Michael added while flipping through notes on his clipboard. With a few modern updates, the property value could increase significantly. Property value. Every sentence stripped another layer of humanity from the walls around me. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Mom, nobody is trying to upset you. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. My son appeared uncomfortable. Yes. Guilty perhaps. But not enough to stop any of this. That realization hurt more than Claire's manipulation ever could. I see, I said softly. Claire stepped forward immediately, mistaking calmness for surrender again. Why do not we sit down after everyone leaves and go over next steps together? Next steps. She spoke like an executive finalizing a merger instead of a daughter-in-law, discussing the future of a grieving widow. Michael checked his watch politely. We should probably finish the upstairs measurements before the light changes. Claire nodded quickly and guided them toward the staircase. As they passed me, I noticed she had already replaced the hallway table centerpiece with something modern and white. Walter hated white flowers indoors during winter. He used to say they made houses feel like hotels. I waited until the group disappeared upstairs before slowly walking into the living room alone. The silence downstairs felt unnatural after so much stage politeness. My eyes moved toward the fireplace mantel where the missing family photographs used to stand. Empty spaces remained in the dust outlines. Claire had not even bothered wiping them away completely. I set my purse down quietly and reached inside for the black folder. Thomas Reed prepared for me. Upstairs, Claire laughed lightly at something the realtor said while footsteps moved across the second-floor ceilings overhead. They sounded confident, comfortable, victorious even. I opened the folder slowly and looked again at Walter's signature beneath the trust documents. Firm, steady, certain. Then I closed the folder carefully and rested one hand against the leather cover while the strangers continued measuring rooms above my head. For the first time since Walter died, I no longer felt like the weakest person inside this house. The following Friday morning, Claire stood in the kitchen wearing cream-colored slacks and a white wool sweater while arranging fresh tulips in a glass vase beside the sink. She looked less like someone mourning a recent loss and more like someone preparing for a magazine photo shoot. Soft instrumental music drifted through the downstairs speakers while the scent of cinnamon candles filled the house so heavily it almost erased the familiar traces of Walter's coffee and cedar cologne. Almost. I entered quietly carrying my tea mug, and Claire immediately turned with one of her polished smiles already prepared. Good morning, she said brightly. The bank appointment is at 11, so we should probably leave around 10:30. Bank appointment. The words landed gently now instead of sharply. Thomas Reed had spent nearly 2 hours with me the day before explaining every detail Walter carefully put into place. Every safeguard, every clause, every quiet contingency my husband built long before illness ever entered our lives. I sat slowly at the kitchen table. What exactly are we signing today? Claire adjusted the tulips slightly before answering. Mostly transitional paperwork. The trust transfer. Utility authority. Things that make ownership simpler moving forward. Ownership. Such a confident word for someone standing inside a house she legally controlled no part of. Upstairs, I heard Ryan's footsteps crossing the hallway. He appeared moments later wearing a navy overcoat and carrying his car keys. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes now. He looked exhausted in the way people do when they spend too long, avoiding truths they already recognize. Morning, Mom, he said softly. I nodded once. Claire poured him coffee before he could reach the machine himself. Small gestures, quiet loyalties. Traffic might be bad because of the snow, she told him while smoothing imaginary wrinkles from his coat sleeve. We should leave early. Ryan glanced toward me briefly. You feeling okay about today? It was the first time all week he had asked how I felt about anything. I wrapped both hands around my mug. I am feeling very clear today. Something in my tone made him hesitate slightly, but Claire stepped in before silence could grow uncomfortable. Good, she said lightly. Once everything is finalized, everyone can finally relax. Finalized. The word echoed faintly through the kitchen while snow drifted softly against the windows overlooking the backyard. Walter used to stand near that exact window every winter morning tossing birdseed across the frozen grass for cardinals. He believed small acts repeated consistently mattered more than grand gestures performed occasionally. I wondered what he would think if he could see his son sitting across from me now, silently allowing someone else to dismantle the home his father built piece by piece. The drive downtown remained mostly quiet. Claire sat in the front passenger seat beside Ryan discussing renovation ideas while I remained in the back seat watching snow-covered neighborhoods pass beyond the windows. The upstairs bathroom definitely needs updating, Claire said while scrolling through photographs on her phone. And if we open the dining room layout slightly, the resale value could increase another 100,000. Resale value again. Ryan nodded absently at red lights while gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He barely spoke during the drive. I wondered if guilt was finally becoming heavier than convenience. When we arrived at the bank building downtown, Claire immediately straightened her coat and checked her reflection in the lobby glass before smiling brightly at the receptionist. "We are here for the Harper appointment," she announced confidently. The receptionist directed us toward a private conference room near the back of the building. Inside waited a polished wooden table, leather chairs, bottled water, and a stack of documents already prepared neatly at one end. Claire's eyes brightened immediately at the sight. "Perfect," she murmured while taking the chair closest to the paperwork. Ryan sat beside her, loosening his tie slightly. I chose the chair directly across from them and folded my gloves carefully into my lap. A young banker entered carrying additional folders. "Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming in today," he said politely. "We just need a few signatures to begin processing the ownership transition documents." Ownership transition. Such professional language for removing a widow from the center of her own life. Claire leaned forward immediately. "Can we start with the property transfer?" The banker nodded and opened the top folder. "Of course." Before he could continue, the conference room door opened again quietly behind us. Thomas Reed stepped inside carrying a black leather briefcase dusted lightly with melting snow. Claire froze instantly. Ryan blinked in confusion. "Thomas," he asked slowly. My attorney removed his gloves calmly and closed the door behind him. "Good morning." Claire recovered first, though the smile returning to her face looked noticeably tighter now. I did not realize Evelyn invited legal counsel. Thomas placed his briefcase carefully on the table before answering. "Mrs. Harper requested my presence regarding all trust-related matters." Trust-related matters. The temperature inside the room seemed to shift almost immediately. The banker glanced uncertainly between everyone before quietly stepping back from the table. Ryan frowned slightly. "Mom, what is going on?" I looked at my son steadily for the first time all morning. "That depends," I said softly. "Did either of you know the house was never legally yours to transfer?" Silence followed. Heavy. Sudden. Absolute. Claire's expression did not collapse immediately. It tightened first, then sharpened. "I do not understand," she said carefully. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed several documents with calm precision. Walter Harper established a protected family trust. 6 years ago, he explained evenly. The property remains solely under Mrs. Harper's authority unless she voluntarily chooses otherwise. Ryan stared at him blankly. "What?" Thomas slid the paperwork across the polished table toward the banker. "Additionally, the trust includes coercion provisions regarding inheritance eligibility should any beneficiary attempt pressure or manipulation following Mr. Harper's death." Claire's face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the fluorescent conference room lighting. Ryan turned slowly toward me, confusion giving way to dawning horror. And for the first time since Walter died, nobody in the room was looking at me like I was powerless anymore. The drive home from the bank felt nothing like the drive there. On the way downtown, Claire had spoken confidently about contractors, resale value, and future renovations while Ryan sat quietly beside her pretending silence was neutrality instead of permission. But now the car carried only the sound of tires moving across wet winter roads and the low hum of the heater fighting against the cold. Claire stared straight ahead through the windshield with both arms folded tightly across her chest. Ryan gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had turned pale. I sat quietly in the back seat watching snow drift softly over the sidewalks of Hartford while the city moved around us as though nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed. Nobody spoke for nearly 15 minutes. Finally, Claire broke the silence first. "You knew," she said sharply without turning around. Her voice no longer carried polished warmth or careful sympathy. The performance had ended at the bank conference table. I looked calmly at the back of her seat. "Walter knew," I replied softly. Ryan swallowed hard beside her. "Mom," his voice sounded fragile now. Younger somehow. Claire turned toward him immediately. "You said the house was yours after your father passed." "That is what I believed," Ryan answered quietly. "Well, apparently your father did not trust either of us enough to say otherwise." There it was. Not grief over betrayal. Not embarrassment. Anger over losing access. I watched Claire carefully in the reflection of the side window while snow-covered neighborhoods passed outside. She looked less composed now. Her lipstick slightly faded. Her jaw tight with frustration. For the first time since Walter died, she no longer looked certain of the future she had already started arranging inside her mind. Ryan finally pulled into the driveway just before sunset. The house stood silent beneath a pale blue winter sky while smoke drifted softly from neighboring chimneys. Normally, Walter would have been outside by now clearing snow from the walkway before it froze overnight. He hated slippery steps, said they made people careless. Ryan turned off the engine but remained motionless behind the wheel. Nobody moved. Claire suddenly opened her door first and stepped outside without another word. Her heels crunched sharply against the snow as she walked toward the front entrance, carrying anger around her like static electricity. Ryan remained staring at the dashboard. "Mom," he said finally, barely above a whisper, "why did Dad do this?" I looked at the back of his head for a long moment before answering. "Because your father paid attention." Ryan closed his eyes briefly. Then he stepped out into the cold without responding. Inside the house, tension settled immediately into the walls like heavy fog. Claire moved quickly through the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors harder than necessary while removing her coat. The tulips she arranged that morning still sat near the sink, pretending normal life existed here. Ryan loosened his tie slowly near the staircase while avoiding eye contact with both of us. I removed my gloves carefully and hung my coat beside Walter's old winter jacket, still resting untouched on the hallway hook. Seeing it there tightened something unexpectedly inside my chest. Walter had prepared for this possibility with calm precision, while I spent years believing love alone kept families decent. "I cannot believe this," Claire said suddenly from the kitchen. "Your father hid an entire trust from you." Ryan rubbed both hands across his face tiredly. Maybe because he knew this would happen. The words landed heavily in the room. Claire turned toward him instantly. "Excuse me." He looked exhausted now. Not angry, just hollowed out by realization. "Claire." He stopped briefly before continuing quieter. "We started discussing selling the house before Mom even finished grieving. We were trying to help her. Were we?" Silence followed. Sharp and uncomfortable. Claire laughed once without humor. "So now I am the villain because I wanted everyone financially secure?" Ryan did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted slowly toward the living room where the empty spaces above the fireplace mantel still marked, where Claire removed our family photographs for staging purposes. "You brought realtors into the house 11 days after Dad died," he said softly. Claire crossed her arms defensively. "Because someone had to think practically." Practical. Such a clean word for something so ugly underneath. I quietly walked past both of them into the living room and lit the small lamp beside Walter's leather chair. Warm amber light filled the corner softly. For weeks after his death, grief had made me feel invisible inside my own home. Now, strangely, I felt completely present again. Behind me, Claire's voice lowered into something colder. "You are seriously taking her side?" Ryan stared at the floor. "There should not be sides." "There absolutely are sides now." I heard footsteps moving sharply across the hardwood floors. A moment later, Claire appeared in the living room doorway, already carrying an overnight bag. I had not even noticed her pack upstairs. "I am going to my mother's house for a few days," she announced stiffly. Ryan looked up immediately. "Claire." "No," she interrupted. "I am not staying here while everyone acts like I manipulated some helpless old woman." Helpless old woman. Interesting choice of words. She turned toward me then, her expression controlled but brittle around the edges. You could have simply told us about the trust from the beginning. I met her eyes calmly. You never asked what Walter wanted. You only asked what you could take over. Her face flushed instantly. For one brief second, I thought she might argue further. Instead, she looked away first. Ryan followed her silently into the hallway while she grabbed her coat and keys. The front door opened. Cold air swept briefly through the foyer. Then the door slammed shut hard enough to rattle the staircase photographs. Silence returned again. Deep. Exhausted. Final. Ryan remained standing near the doorway long after Claire's car disappeared down the snowy street. Finally, he turned toward me slowly, looking far older than 42 years old. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I made a terrible mistake." I looked at my son standing beneath the same hallway light Walter installed 20 years ago after Ryan complained the stairs felt too dark at night. Back then, he used to trust us completely. Somewhere along the way, he learned to trust convenience more. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "No, Ryan," I said softly. "You made several." 3 weeks after the bank meeting, the house finally sounded like itself again. The forced laughter was gone. The endless conversations about contractors, staging, and resale value had disappeared with Claire's overnight bags and carefully rehearsed smiles. In their place returned the quieter sounds Walter and I spent decades building our lives around. The grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway. The soft hum of the dishwasher after dinner. Snow melting slowly from the gutters beneath the first hints of approaching spring. Some evenings I still caught myself expecting Walter to walk through the front door, carrying groceries, or complaining about Connecticut traffic. Grief does not leave all at once. It fades unevenly like winter snow lingering in shaded corners long after the rest has melted away. Ryan visited every Sunday now, always alone. The first few visits felt awkward in ways neither of us knew how to fix. He moved carefully through the house, as though afraid touching anything might remind him of how close he came to losing it all, or perhaps how close he came to losing himself. One Sunday afternoon, I found him standing silently in Walter's study staring at the old fishing photograph still resting on the desk beside the lamp. The same photograph he barely noticed for years suddenly seemed impossible for him to look away from. "Dad loved that trip," he said quietly without turning around. I folded a blanket over the armchair before answering. "You caught exactly 1 fish in 3 days." Ryan laughed softly under his breath for the first time in weeks. I remember pretending it was enough to impress him. "Your father was never impressed by fish." Ryan looked down at the floor then. I think I disappointed him. The sentence settled heavily between us. I crossed the room slowly and rested my hand against the back of Walter's chair. "Your father understood weakness," I said gently. What mattered to him was whether people recognized it before it became their character. Ryan swallowed hard. He looked older now. Not physically. Spiritually, perhaps. Like someone forced to meet himself honestly for the first time in years. Claire remained at her mother's house throughout most of February. At first, Ryan defended her gently, saying she needed space after everything that happened. But eventually, even those explanations faded away. Some truths become impossible to soften after enough silence passes around them. One afternoon, Ryan arrived unexpectedly, carrying a cardboard box filled with the family photographs Claire removed from the living room before the realtor visits. He placed the box carefully on the dining table without speaking. I opened it slowly. Christmas mornings. School graduations. Summer cookouts. Walter asleep in lawn chairs during 4th of July fireworks. 38 years of ordinary moments once considered obstacles to resale value, now stacked quietly in a cardboard box. Ryan rubbed both hands together nervously. I should have stopped her sooner. I looked down at a photograph of Walter teaching Ryan how to shovel snow beside the driveway when he was 8 years old. Both of them wore matching red gloves. "You should have stopped yourself," I said softly. Ryan lowered his eyes immediately because he knew I was right. Blaming Claire alone would have been easier. Cleaner. But weakness, shared willingly, still belongs partly to the person who accepts it. Slowly, life inside the house settled into something new. Not the old life. That was gone forever with Walter. But something steadier. Then grief alone. I had the hallway wallpaper repaired instead of replaced. I returned every family photograph to its original place above the fireplace mantel. Thomas Reed finalized revisions to the trust exactly as Walter instructed years ago. Ryan remained included, but the structure changed permanently. Some forms of trust do not fully regenerate once broken. On the first warm Saturday in March, I stood in the backyard spreading birdseed across the thawing grass, while early spring sunlight filtered through the trees. Walter loved this time of year most. He used to say winter teaches people which things are truly built to survive. Behind me, the sliding glass door opened quietly. Ryan stepped onto the deck, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I made yours the way Dad used to," he said awkwardly. I accepted the cup carefully. The coffee tasted slightly too bitter. Walter always measured exactly 2 scoops. Ryan never remembered the second one. We stood silently watching cardinals gather near the fence line, while cold wind moved softly through the trees. Finally, Ryan spoke again. "Do you think Claire ever loved this family?" I thought about the question carefully before answering. I think Claire loved security, control, the appearance of success. Ryan stared out across the backyard. "And me?" I looked at my son standing where Walter once stood every spring morning for nearly 4 decades. "I think she loved the version of you that stopped questioning her." Silence followed again. Not angry silence. Sadder than that. Mature enough to hold truth without arguing against it. Ryan nodded slowly as though hearing something he already suspected for a very long time. A bird landed near Walter's old flower bed, while sunlight warmed the edges of the deck railing. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood, church bells rang softly through the cold March air. I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and closed my eyes briefly against the sunlight. For weeks after Walter died, everyone treated me like a fragile old woman waiting to be relocated somewhere smaller, quieter, easier to manage. They mistook grief for helplessness. They mistook silence for surrender. But Walter knew better. And now, finally, so did I. Some people regret what they did. Others regret discovering too late that I was never powerless at all.